How can hurt, heartache, and tragedy become the keys to unlocking greatness? We'll find out on this episode of ShiftShapers.
Change either energizes or paralyzes. The choice is yours. This is the ShiftShapers Podcast, bringing the employee benefits industry interviews with individuals and companies who are shaping the industry shifts. And now, here's your host, David Saltzman.
And to help us answer that question, we've invited Ryan Miller. Ryan is a performance coach, a consultant, a keynote speaker, and his book called Wounds is a really fascinating read, and I commend it to everybody. Go to Amazon, buy a copy for a friend. It's a very different kind of a read than you may ever have been used to. And with that, welcome, Ryan. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. It's good to be able to chat.
Always my pleasure. Always my pleasure. So let's talk a little bit about your professional background first, just so folks know kind of how you got to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I'll make this brief because if not, we'd be here all day. So I literally fell into sales. I was 20 years old. I was working in the warehouse of an aftermarket parts shop for cars because that's what I loved to do. I saw guys inside the office that were clean, all the while I was dirty out in the warehouse every single day. I kept begging the CEO of the company to bring me inside, and eventually I broke him, and he let me jump in that door. And I fell in love with the ability to be able to communicate with people. At that time, I thought sales was about convincing people to buy things they didn't want, and so I thought I was really good at that, and I was just a young, ignorant 20-something, and as time went on, I just continued to learn that I had been wired in such a way that I loved engaging with other people, understanding the challenges that they face and figuring out ways to solve the problems and be the hero in the process, so that was just awesome. Fast forward all the way through to 2011, I had spent time in the automotive industry, in the construction industry, in the print and document management industry, and I found myself on the back end of the recession without a job. I was one of the top salespeople in the organization, but we were a publicly traded company and we were bleeding money everywhere and they needed my salary. And so they laid me off. That was April of 2011. April of 2011. And I started interviewing for other companies, and I remember I got a really great job offer to lead a sales team for Xerox, and I called my wife as soon as I walked out the door because she was at home with my 2 kids, a mortgage, and we had $500 to our name. And I said, babe, I don't think I can take another job. She goes, what, you didn't get the offer? And I said, actually I did, but I just don't feel this is right. And so, like my wife has been so incredible in doing, she said, I trust you. If you think you know what you're doing, go ahead. And so that was my dive into sales training, coaching, and consulting. Along the way, I picked up some chops in the benefits world. I actually went to work for one of my clients for about 3 years, a regional firm here in SoCal. That was my exposure to meeting great people like you. And so today here I sit, and the only difference in when I went out in 2011 and what I do now is I've come to realize that the tools, sales process, sales strategy is easy. It's simple. Everybody has access to them. I try to give those away as much as possible. What truly makes people successful is themselves. And so I try to help them overcome the self-limiting beliefs, the challenges that they face, the wounds that they experience, and ultimately just become the men and women that they've been created to be and leverage those things to achieve the lives of their dreams.
It sounds so simple, and yet it takes work. It takes real work to get there. Even for somebody who's been at it as long as I have, every day is a new learning experience. And I'm glad you're doing it. So let's talk a little bit about kind of origins and whatnot. You were a pretty free-spirited kid. Is that where your story starts?
Yeah. So, before reflecting back in my writing process, I would say that from the time that my parents divorced, I was 6, my brother was 3. When my dad left, he cut up all my mom's credit cards. She didn't have a job because she was a stay-at-home mom. And so I had to fight to survive. And it may not have really started at 6 years old, but pretty quickly I had to become the man of the house. My mom worked 2 and 3 jobs for us to be able to survive. So she would go to a day job all day. She would come home. She would quickly make hot dogs and macaroni and cheese, which is what we lived off of for quite a few years. And then she would go to Macy's and work the jewelry department. Or, and then she would get home at 11 o'clock at night. She would make sure we were in bed and okay. And then she would wake up in the morning and do it all over again. So that survival and independence, which was really good to help support my mom, turned into really a lot of ignorance, self-reliance, and self-dependence that created what, you alluded to being that free spirit, because I just started fighting for the things that I wanted. I, started stepping into crowds that I felt I could be accepted into, and that led to partying and fighting and getting in trouble with the law. And so I would say it's interesting, like what started off as a good trait in learning to, be dependent and lead at a young age just went awry because it was so much about self-reliance.
At what point did stuff start dawning on you that, hey, there's got to be a better way? Was it, we'll get into your experience in Las Vegas in a minute or two, but as a younger guy, did you understand that you were creating as many problems for yourself as you were?
Yeah, it's interesting because as a teenager, so it was really my freshman year, I started dabbling in drinking and smoking pot, but it wasn't really till my junior year that I started living this kind of duality of life in a way, which was my mom had raised me right. So even though I was getting involved with a lot of girls at the time, I was very respectful of them. I tried not to go off the reservation at school and maintained my grades fairly well, but I was still ditching class. I would go out at night and we would party, and we were getting into lots of fights just in the local communities of our area. But I would wake up in the morning and it was like, what am I doing? But I was so caught up in the acceptance, the popularity, that kind of fun and risky side of it, that it would always draw me back in. And there's a brief moment that I recount in my book, but like there was a specific fight that we were in, and long story short, when everybody went to the 6 or 7 guys I was with went to get in this fight with 40 people, we were far outnumbered. I was sent back to go get a gun from under the seat of one of my buddy's trucks. And when I went back to them later, every single one of them had the living crap beat out of them. I mean, one guy had his head split down to the bone. Another one had multiple broken ribs. We rushed 2 people to the hospital. And those were the moments that I was like, this is not me. Like I was a scrawny 6'1", 140-pound wet kid at that time. Like I didn't have any place fighting. I didn't grow up in the rough and tumble of the inner city. I just found myself in these places trying to fight for acceptance and found it. And so that was where I started to be like, man, like, is this really my life? But I just didn't have the wherewithal or the tools to overcome it because I was just too caught up in being drawn in.
You talk a lot in the book, and we'll explore that as we go along, about God stepping in. Sometimes you realize it, sometimes you don't. Squire Rushnell wrote a bunch of books called God Winks, which is, stuff that happens to you and you don't really realize it at the time because you're not cognizant. You alluded to being sent back to the truck to get a gun, but there wasn't a gun. And the guy who sent you knew that. What's that part of the story about?
Yeah, so what's so fascinating, David, is so I grew up in the Catholic Church. I walked away in early high school, as late junior high, early high school, as most young kids do, kind of just figuring themselves out. Obviously started getting into a lot of trouble, so I wanted nothing to do with that. I wouldn't come to faith until 2006, which I was 28 at the time. So this in between, this probably 15 to 28, there was so many moments just like that one. That was totally God, because had I been in that situation, maybe I would have been the one that got killed, or maybe I would have been the one that just got beat up way worse, or maybe I would have been the one that, God forbid, there would have been a gun and I came back and just pulled the trigger. And so it's so interesting to me how in moments like that, I can now look back, as we all have great 2020 vision looking backwards, and realize that He wasn't protecting me from everything, because I had to learn those lessons. I had to get punched in the face and have my teeth go through my bottom lip. Like a lot of those things had to happen. But at the same time, He was just this good father that was letting me get hurt without allowing me to completely destroy myself.
And yet the message came through your friend who knew there wasn't a gun in the truck when he sent you back. Did you confront him? Did you talk to him about that afterwards?
Yeah, so this is so crazy, because that guy would go on to be one of the biggest troublemakers of everybody. He got into so much, and he wasn't like, he was a good guy, but wasn't a good guy. Like nobody could really completely trust him. And yet he made this judgment call to protect me in that moment, because the girl I was dating was pregnant. And so afterwards, I said to him, his name was Ty, and I was like, dude, what were you thinking? And without even questioning it, this was like I think it was the next day or a couple of days later, we were in my driveway, and he said, Janet, that was my girlfriend. He said, Janet was pregnant. She was already freaking out that you were getting involved into this in the first place. I didn't want to put her in a worse position, and I didn't want that baby to be without a father, which if you read the book, you will later find out that wasn't my child anyway. But it was like, this is what's so interesting to me. Like, I don't believe everybody's good. I believe that there is a lot of evil in this world, and there are a lot of people doing a lot of evil things. But in the midst of this group of teenage kids that was getting into lots of trouble and fighting and stealing and breaking the law and doing a lot of really bad things, there was still a lot of good deep down in the roots of them. And thank God, me too, because if it was all about evil and ill, I mean, I don't even know where I would be.
And now, a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by MZQ Consulting, a concierge compliance firm that excels at making the complex simple. Have you seen the news lately? Johnson & Johnson is being sued because J&J's health plans failed to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs. In the case of one drug, the plan paid $10,000 for a drug that regularly is available for under $80. Not only were the members of the benefits committee named personally, but their benefits advisor was also named in the suit. And that, dear listeners, is why you need a top-flight compliance firm. Yes, MZQ handles all the usual compliance stuff, from ACA reporting and tracking to wrap documents 5500s, mental health NQTL and QTL analysis, and a whole lot more. But the heat is being turned up on fiduciaries who don't act like it. In this environment, using an ERISA attorney-led compliance consulting firm is your best strategy. Your clients too. And MZQ Consulting is where you should go. For more information, go to www.mzqconsulting.com or email them today at engage@mzqconsulting.com. Now, back to our conversation. For somebody who lives in Southern California, you're a big country music fan. Like real country music, not, the crossover stuff we're seeing a lot of now. That brought you to probably what must have been one of the most traumatic experiences that you could possibly have. Would you share that story, and then we'll turn back around to how that's made a difference?
Yeah. So as you alluded to, huge country music fan. We were 15, 16 live shows into the year come October of 2017, late September, early October. And so my wife, Michelle, myself, and 5 of our friends headed to Las Vegas for what was going to be our second year at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. That year was being headlined by Jason Aldean, and he was the one that I wanted to see more than anyone that year. He was the final headliner on the final night. And so we ended up in what was the best from a viewing and experience standpoint, and yet the worst place in that show, because when gunfire rained down later that night, we were on the side of the venue that was closest to the Mandalay Bay, which is kind of crazy to say because the Mandalay Bay was down the street and across the street, but we were the one that was closest to. And so, even all these years later, it's so crazy for me to think about the fact that, so I still can see as I closed my eyes, the first round of gunfire hit the ground. And so about 50 feet from us, just ahead of us, in between us and the barrier to the actual stage, there was this concentrated, what looked like fireworks going off on the ground. And we were on a combination of turf and asphalt. And I can still see it. It just boom, 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 boom. Well, up to that point, we hadn't seen many mass shootings. Up to that point, I had never heard of any kind of violent outbreak at all at a country concert or festival. Like, these are people that love each other, there's rarely even a fight. And so I thought it was fireworks, as did everybody else. It startled us, but it didn't really do anything to disturb what we were doing. So then, a second couple of shots fired. And then when the third ones came out, that's when Jason ran off a stage, the lights went down. And so the venue was almost completely dark and everybody hit the ground. And I remember, sorry if this is long-winded and you can cut me off at any time, but
nope, you take your time.
When that happened, my wife was yelling, like screaming. And so I go for her. Well, come to find out, thank God she wasn't hit, because we didn't even know it was gunfire at that point yet, or it wasn't 100% sure. It was just somebody on her. So I pull this other lady off of her. I grab my wife, and as I grab my wife, she says, "Oh my gosh, looks like Nicole is hit." And so Nicole Kimura, she was my best friend's girlfriend at the time, a really close friend of ours. And she was laying face down, and you could see that there was some blood coming from her rear right side, like lower kidney area. And so we stood up to try and kind of like collect ourselves to see what was going on. And as soon as we went to go for Nicole, gunfire again. And as that happened, Michelle went to the ground, my wife, and I had this split second, which felt like a million years decision, which was, what do I do now? And the only thing that I thought was like, I can't let her get hit. And so I just jumped on her, and I had a backpack on. And I remember just grabbing the straps of the backpack, laying on top of her, just cringing and waiting for what I felt for sure was coming. And by God's grace, I did not. And as soon as that pause, this was like his reload moments, we kind of stood up again, but now the crowd is starting, you can tell, like everyone now has figured out what is going on. And so I'm not letting go of Michelle, because I'm not going to let her get trampled, pulled, dragged through. But Chad, my best friend, he's yelling like, "We've got to get Nicole. We've got to get Nicole." And so we turn her over. She's bleeding through the front as well. And we're trying to pick her up and can't, because she's all but dead weight at that moment. The crowd is starting to run. I'm trying to hold, it's absolute chaos. And I was actually talking about this the other day. It's like, I've never been in war. I was never in the military. I was never a police officer. Like, you don't prepare for things like this. And yet again, God's kindness was him allowing me to have laser focus in the moment on what was important. And that was my wife. So we were able to run to the side. My wife and I were just gunfire and gunfire and gunfire. And I guess I'll leave at least this moment and then pause with this was, again, there was just there's these snapshots. I don't remember everything, throughout, but there was this other snapshot, which was when my wife and I ran to the side, we hid behind these bleachers. There was only about 8 rows of bleachers. It was fairly short, temporary bleacher area, and it was just sardine cans packed with people underneath. We were trying to get underneath to protect ourselves and couldn't. There was no room. So we're crouched down. I'm staring at her face to face. Her back is what would be kind of to where the shots were coming from. And I just don't want her to take her eyes off of me. And I looked her in the eyes and I told her I loved her. Everything was going to be okay. The first part I meant with wholehearted truth. The second part, I had no idea whether or not that was a reality. But I told her I loved her because I felt like there was a possibility that one or both of us was never going to get to say that again. And I was able to, by God's grace, get us out of there. We were able to get to safe haven. But, again, it was just, it was moments like that, excuse me, that, I don't know, as I reflect back, again, whether it was Ty and the gun in the fight, or in this situation, the moments of jumping on my wife or looking her in the eyes, it was like God had given me exactly what I needed in the moment to do what needed to happen just to survive the next moment. And I don't like that. I want a lifelong clarity of plan. I want to know what's going to work. I want to know how it's going to work. I want to follow through. And yet I find, which just kind of like gut punches me as I'm saying this out loud, even in a season I'm in right at the moment, that that's not how God works a lot of times, and definitely not with me.
Yeah, you get the test first and the lesson afterwards, and that's really hard. And ultimately, you did lose Nicole.
Yeah. And, that was one of those things where, so as we ran off to the side, I looked back out across the venue, and there's just bodies everywhere, people that were injured, people that had already died. And there is Chad standing over Nicole, kneeling over her. And, Chad and I have been, at that point I was 39. Chad and I had been friends we were born on the same street. We grew up together, preschool, kindergarten, like everything. That was the most proud, not only I had ever been of him, but I had ever been of knowing anybody in my life to that point. Because it wasn't even his wife, it was his girlfriend, and they were actually kind of playing around with the fact of whether or not that was even the case. And yet I knew how much he loved her, but like, he didn't need to do that. And then on top of that, at that point, I wouldn't know this till later, but she'd already been called dead by an off-duty medic that had happened to run by him and said, like, and yet he would not leave. And it was just this picture of just like incredible honor and protection, just like what it means to me to really be a man. And then I would end up finding out about an hour later, because we got separated, Michelle and I did, from everybody else. He called me and told me, that had in fact happened, that she was confirmed dead. And it was crazy because I saw it with my own eyes. I heard her say, like, I can't feel my legs. And we knew she was taking her last breaths when we were over her. And yet there's always this hope that you either didn't see reality or something would save the day in the moment. And yet I remember, man, when I got that call from him, and he's screaming because he's still in chaos, and we're in chaos down in a basement in the Tropicana. And I remember him saying, Nicole didn't make it. Nicole didn't make it. And I remember just screaming, knowing that she was gone, knowing what heartbreak he felt in that moment, knowing what that felt like to Michelle and I and all of our friends. Like, it was just like, it's still, here it is, right? This has been almost 7 years, and sometimes I can talk about this without batting an eye because I've said it so many times, and other times when I really think about the moments, it's just like, gosh, it's brutal, that things like this just tear people apart. And it's not just me, because so many people go through things like this.
Sure. The book outlines 9 different types of wounds, but I was struck by something that didn't make sense to me until I finished the book, because it was in the foreword. And the foreword says, these wounds can transform us. How can they transform us? And I know you've developed a framework. You call it the wound analysis framework. Would you share that and how that can help us from these terrible, horrible things, these lessons that we need to learn? How can they teach us?
Yeah. So I hate to admit this. In many ways, I'm a fast learner, but when it comes to learning my own lessons, I'm not. And so, as you will read in the book, like, I made many horrific errors in life and judgment, and just committed sins against so many people, and things were done to me. And it was like over and over and over again, I wasn't learning my lessons. And so through the journey from 2017 to writing the book in 2022, but even more so as the book was being written, this framework started to become a reality when a consultant I was working with on a different project was asking me why I was so passionate about helping men specifically. I have a specific area of coaching that I do specifically for men. And he's like, why do you care so much? And I'm like, because my marriage is broken and because this and because that. And he says, do you think it has anything to do with the fact that your dad left you when you were 6? And I'm like, nope. I said, I'm way past that. Like that, I've healed from that. My dad and I didn't talk for 10 years, which I share in the book. And then now my dad's one of my best friends. I'm like, that's so past me. He says, I want you to take some time to go back and look at that and tell me whether or not this has actually had the impact that I think it has. And this isn't even his role. Like his role was to build a marketing strategy. It was crazy. Anyway, so as I dug back in, I realized, David, that I hadn't completely learned. I had almost fully healed, but I had not completely learned from that initial wound of my dad leaving. And as I dug into that, and so the framework being this idea that you acknowledge the fact that you were hurt. And so I had been able to do that way back then, and then at different periods of life as I reconciled with my dad. So, but that's the first thing, is like, we have to own it. We were hurt. And especially as men, this is way harder for men to do, I believe, than it is for women. Men put up this tough exterior. It's like, nobody can hurt me. Nobody can penetrate me. I'm like, no, this freaking hurt. Like, it just, in the moment, it hurt. Secondly to that, and this is where I really started to understand and gain clarity, is to realize the effect of that hurt, of that wound. And so, you know, when you see this thread that's hanging from a piece of clothing and you go to pull it, and as you pull it, it keeps pulling and pulling. And as it does, it's opening a hole somewhere else, and it's bunching up the seam in one spot and opening a hole in the seam. Like, it's the thread that keeps pulling through. And what I realized was that wound was the thread that pulled. Like, it wasn't my dad's fault. And I say this over and over and over again. It was mine. It was the impact of my dad. But at 6, I didn't have the tools. But then even when I started to get them, I just pushed them away. But I realized that was what started me down this trajectory of trying to prove to everybody else that I was something that I wasn't, because I wanted to be accepted. And what was interesting was I was good in school. I was an above average athlete. Like, my work would have spoke for itself, but that wasn't good enough. And so I had to understand that ripple that was caused as that thread kept getting pulled had done damage. And I needed to understand what damage it did at different stages of my life. But it wasn't just about damage, because again, just like getting beat up, but not to the point of death, or being in Route 91, but not being killed myself, or not losing my wife, was, okay, if all of this is happening and I'm surviving it, then there's meaning behind it. And not everybody attributes this, like, not everybody believes in God. I respect that completely. Not everybody would even agree with this statement, and I respect that completely. But there's this key passage in the Bible in Genesis chapter 50 where it says, what man means for evil, God means for good. And so I had to understand that there is nothing about Route 91 that was good. Nothing. 0, 0, 0, 0. Even you could say, well, there were survivors. Yes, but still people died. Like, there was nothing good. But good can come from it. And the good was, even though I had a great relationship with my wife, I was able to better value the precious moments of not wasting every moment with her and with my friends, and understanding that if I could survive something like that, then I could survive whining about not getting a business deal that I think I deserved and worked really hard for. And so that's, when I say, like, unlock greatness, people kind of go to the place of, oh, so you're telling me that if I heal from my wounds, that I'm going to stand on the top step of the podium? And I'm like, maybe. But what greatness to me really is, above all else, and this is the punchline to the whole thing, so I guess you don't even have to read it anymore. Greatness to me ultimately is understanding who you've been created to be and living as the best version of that human being to live the life that you dream of. And I just feel like in a day and age where We're chasing monetary success for good or for bad, when we're looking to everybody else as an example and as a model of what to live by, and trying to bolt on all these new ideas and strategies and innovation, we miss the key in all of it, which is us. We are uniquely wired. I mean, you've been incredibly successful in your career, and yet I don't want to live your life. Like, I want to live mine. Now, I may be able to learn and glean wisdom and insight from you, but I don't want to model my life after yours. I want to live the life that I've been called to. And so that's where this idea of unlocking greatness comes into play. And then what's super cool is, once I figure out who I am, what I'm really good at, and I can begin to heal, then I start to produce the highest levels of achievement in all these areas that I'm focused on.
And that is a great place to end our conversation for today. Folks, get the book. It's called Wounds by Ryan Miller, Ryan James Miller on the cover. It's a terrific read. It will take you to places that you haven't thought about, but that you should. Ryan, thanks so much for sharing your time and your story with our audience.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it.
Shout out to the crew at Grand River Agency for their awesome post-production. This ShiftShapers podcast is copyrighted content and may not be reproduced in whole or in part without the express written permission of ShiftShapers Solutions, LLC. Copyright 2024.